Plyometrics, Chapter 18. This is a fun one because it's all directly applicable. In fact, this morning I was doing some plyos, thinking about these slides and how to apply them. So plyometrics, first of all, I'm going to just say this right out the gate. Do not say plyometrics. I know it's easy to get it mixed up, especially when the word is new to you. But if you say plyometrics, you're immediately labeling yourself as either somebody who's new to the field or who doesn't have a lot of experience with it. And language is important. So plyometrics, plyometrics. Now we're going to cover this in three parts. The first part is foundations of plyometric training. Objectives. By the end of this section, you all should be able to define plyometric training. Yeah, Amanda's laughing at that. I'm sure you hear that sometimes too. My students say it all the time, plyometrics. Define plyometric training and explain its purpose in athletic performance. Describe the mechanical and neurophysiological models underlying the stretch shortening cycle. That one is huge. That's a very important one that will absolutely be on the exam, and it's one of the harder concepts. Identify the phases of the stretch shortening cycle and their role in force production, and differentiate plyometric exercises from ballistic movements. That's a common misnomer that sometimes I also fall prey to as well, calling something that's merely ballistic plyometric, when in fact it's distinct and they're separate. We'll talk about that. So, introduction to plyometric training. Let's define it. Plyometric training is a method of enhancing muscular power and neuromuscular efficiency by exploiting the stretch shortening cycle to generate greater force in minimal time. The minimal time part there is important, and that's a key component of plyometrics. So this targets the rapid transition between eccentric and concentric muscle actions. All right, and it's commonly utilized in sports requiring explosive movements like sprinting, volleyball, spiking, change of direction in any sport. Pretty much any strength and power sport that has a change of direction component or an acceleration component, plyometrics are very important for them. Even something like weightlifting that doesn't have change of direction or acceleration, it has acceleration of an external mass, and so plyos are very beneficial as well for weightlifters. Some sports may not benefit as much from plyometrics, like something like swimming, until you consider that they're jumping off blocks, and that's very important as they dive into the pool. So that's an important part. Pushing off the wall, that's important as well. Something like powerlifting, less so as well, although for overall pliability and stiffness, as well as extensibility, plyometric series for powerlifters can be beneficial, I believe, especially as part of their GPP phase. Cyclists, especially long distance cyclists, may not be as important for them outside of just general health and tendon function, just because it's just a cyclical concentric contraction the whole time. There's no impact in their sport. There's no eccentric muscle action in cycling. And then other sports that might be like cycling, and I'm struggling to think of any, maybe hand cycling, wheelchair cycling is the same thing. It's all concentric. And so all that to say, the vast majority of sports benefit from plyometric training. So the neuromechanical objective of plyometrics is to improve the rate of force development and movement economy via enhanced intramuscular and intermuscular coordination. So RFD, remember, that's the speed at which force can be produced, and it's critical for acceleration and agility. Essentially, if you look at a force time curve trace in, let's say, an isometric mid-thigh pull, and in case you forget what that is, it's where you pull on a bar that doesn't move. It's at about hip level, just below hip level, and it's in the position of the second pull of a power clean. So your knees are slightly bent, hips are slightly flexed, and you're pulling as hard as you can as you push into a force plate. And your force curve trace is going to be steady when you're not pulling, and then it's going to go up as you're pulling. And you're pulling, and it's going to waver around a little bit. And the slope of that curve, of that force generation curve, is the rate of force development. And so if you pull gradually and you just put slight tension on the bar and then you gradually push and crank on it, then you're going to see the force go up like this. Okay. If you go 3, 2, 1, and you explode into it, not with a counter movement, because that actually is not part of the standardization. It's cheating the test if you try to dip into it. But if you if you have tension on the bar and then 3, 2, 1, and you explode into it as hard and as fast as you can. Your body doesn't move, but you're rapidly generating force by recruiting all of your motor units synchronously, or as many as you can. If you recruited all of them, your muscles would shear right off the bone. But as many as you can, then you're going to see your force time curve tracing go like this. And that's what rate of force development is. Now, that's in an isometric condition. In a plyometric condition, a plyometric action, remember, that's a rapid eccentric followed by concentric. And so instead of being isometric, meaning the muscle doesn't change length, we are coming in from either a vertical or a horizontal or combination sort of impact into the ground. And that rate of force development eccentrically will be very rapid as we hit the ground. And the stretch shortening cycle is what takes that force and either is able to store it and then use it in rapid concentric force production, or if you have a poorly functioning stretch shortening cycle, it will be, that energy will be dissipated as heat, which we don't want. And typically it'll like go into the tendons or into the bones and potentially over time build up into something like a stress fracture or other soft tissue injury. And so plyometrics are important for handling forces and for expressing forces after that eccentric period. Also, it's important for movement economy. Okay, so it reduces the metabolic cost of skilled explosive movements, meaning if you only used concentric muscle action for these movements, it would actually cost you metabolically much more in ATP, because it's now, instead of storing the energy and returning it, now you're having to produce all of it every time, and you lose all the energy that you've just produced on the subsequent step. It's like, when we run, like imagine for instance, a very efficient runner. Picture the Kenyan Olympians or the Ethiopian Olympians, and these days actually it's people from every country that and just about every race who are showing up at the Olympic finals. It's not so much Kenyan and Ethiopian dominated anymore, but picture them, because they have such a fluid, beautiful running form. And you can imagine that every single step that they take, they have such long tendons, and even though they may have long pendulums for legs, there's not very much muscle mass on those legs. And yet they're running at very high speeds for a long time. And that's because the elastic energy return from their legs they're like springs. And so the metabolic cost of running at that speed is so much lower than, let's say, someone of the same anthropometrics, but perhaps they have only trained muscularly with concentric movements, maybe even eccentric concentric, but no plyos. They never run. And so they have a very inefficient energy storage and return. They're going to be slogging along with their foot, spending a ton of time on the ground as they try to muscle the force into their next step. And maybe some of you feel like that when you run. And I know I feel like that often when I'm running, because I don't run very much anymore. And so that's kind of the difference as far as movement economy and efficiency goes. So let's talk about the two models. This is the mechanical model first of the stretch shortening cycle. This involves a few components. The first is the series elastic component, or SEC. This is passive elastic structures like tendons and cross-bridge linkages in the collagen that store mechanical energy during the eccentric phase and release it in the concentric phase. Okay, so we have this eccentric loading that stretches the series elastic component and stores potential energy. The amortization phase following that, this is a brief isometric transition between eccentric and concentric muscle actions. And this must be minimized to retain the energy. So think of, and again, this is not a plyometric, this would be a ballistic movement, but think of a counter movement jump, okay, because it still uses the stretch shortening cycle. A counter movement jump, you dip down and then explode up. And you're dipping down to activate this stretch shortening cycle to get more up on your jump, to get more activation of the agonist, to get more elastic energy return, to sort of trip your myotatic stretch reflex, okay? And so if on that dip, you purposefully pause for 3 seconds at the bottom, so you dip down, but then you pause. 1, 2, 3, and then jump. you can imagine, hopefully as I was counting, you were putting yourself in that position. You can imagine like, oh, you're going to want to like dip again. It's going to be hard to generate force from that position. And it's because you're doing it with only concentric muscle action. All the force that you gathered on the way down has dissipated. And so the differential there is the contribution from the stretch shortening cycle. And we actually can test the health, the performance or health of the stretch shortening cycle of an athlete by comparing their counter movement jump to their squat jump or their static squat jump. And the difference in jump height and some of the differences in jump strategy, let's say peak power production or something, are reflective of what their stretch shortening cycle is capable of. So let's say you have one athlete, you do counter movement jump, you do static squat jumps, and they jump 5 centimeters higher on their counter movement jump. Well, then we would say the contribution of their stretch shortening cycle is 5 centimeters in that case, if we were quantifying it that way. Let's say that in terms of power, maybe it's 300 watts higher in peak power, okay, that they've generated in a counter movement versus a static jump. Then we would say that contribution was from the stretch shortening cycle. Now, some athletes, especially athletes like weightlifters or powerlifters who are very force dominant and trained from these explosive positions and who are very strong through a full range of motion, oftentimes you'll see that their counter movement jumps and static jumps are very similar. And that's because it may not be that their stretch shortening cycle is not very well trained. It could be the case, but it's not always the case. It may just be that they're so darn strong that they can actually make up the difference concentrically. And so it depends on the training of your athlete as well. But back to the sequence. So we have eccentric amortization and then the concentric phase. And during the concentric phase, that's where this converted energy that was stored is now released into kinetic output. It's stored and then converted into kinetic output. Okay, so the key point here is that the faster and more forceful a muscle is stretched eccentrically, the greater the potential for recoil and explosive force during the concentric phase. This is why, let's say you're training to dunk a basketball. I was training for that for a little bit. I didn't actually get to the point of dunking before I eventually injured myself in another way and had to pull away from that. That's still kind of low-key a goal of mine. Maybe by the time I'm 40, before I'm 40, I would like to dunk a basketball. We'll see. First goal is hitting a 275 clean. Then I'd like to hit 315. And I'd like to also bench 3 plates as well. I don't know if I'll ever get there. And I'd like to squat 400 and I'd like to deadlift 500 as initial goals before I'm 40. But another potential is dunking a basketball. That would be cool. Because that's one that I've actually none of those I've ever done before. But yeah, I've never been super good at jumping. Anyways, that's an aside. But the point is, when you're training to dunk a basketball, it's much harder to do it off a standing 2-foot jump. Also harder to do it off a standing 1-foot jump. If you're doing an approach, let's say you're doing a 2-foot approach jump with 1 step, you don't get a lot of speed into it with just 1 step. It's more than just a standing jump. But you'll notice if you get your timing and your rhythm down, taking a full speed approach where you get 5 or 6 steps to really gather speed and then push yourself, like project yourself horizontally and down into the block step, you're going to get a lot more vertical on your jump. And that's because of this concept right here, where the muscle, the more forcefully it's stretched eccentrically, the more energy is stored up. And so that's when you see people go up for a massive jump or like a big rebound. They if you watch it in slow motion, you'll see their penultimate step and their hips actually are projecting forward and down very rapidly. And then their block step, it looks like, oof, maybe that's not good for them orthopedically. And maybe it's not for an untrained individual, but they've trained for this and are, have adapted to this and are robust in these positions. Their block step just basically stops them short as all that force is then gathered up into that spring of their blocking leg, and their trail leg comes through, plants, and then they are able to jump super high. Okay. An analogous concept here is like stretching a rubber band. The greater the stretch, the greater the snap. Okay. But only if the recoil is immediate. So on a rubber band, the time horizon is much longer, but like if you stretch a rubber band and just hold it there forever, it's eventually just going to lose its elasticity and become overstretched, and it will lose its recoil. You have to let it snap But I mean, with the rubber band, you could hold it for 3 seconds. It'll snap the same amount. So the time horizon is a bit different, but it's kind of like a rubber band. So that was the mechanical model. Okay, let's talk about the neurophysiological model. And actually, you know what? Before we talk about this, I should say, in addition to the series elastic component, there's also the parallel elastic component, and there's also the contractile component. So the series elastic component, as I said, the tendon and the musculotendinous junction. The parallel elastic component, that includes even the muscle membranes themselves, as well as the endo, peri, and epimysium. So the sheaths, essentially, that surround the muscle, the fascicles, and the muscle fibers that run throughout the entire muscle and are continuous with the tendon. That would be the parallel elastic component. So those, together with the series elastic component and the contractile components of the myofibrils themselves, those make up all of the mechanical model of the stretch running cycle. All right, so the mechanical model is one way of thinking of it, but it's only half of the equation, because the other side is the neurophysiological model, okay? And this is where we have the reflexive potentiation. Think back to the myotatic or stretch reflex. This is where we have muscle spindles, those are proprioceptors, involved, and the muscle spindles are those intrafusal proprioceptors that detect the rate and magnitude of muscle stretch and facilitate a reflexive contraction via the alpha motor neuron activation. So recall that muscle spindles are embedded within the muscle. Okay, they're intrafusal fibers. When they are stretched rapidly, they send a signal back to the spinal cord that does not reach the brainstem. It's not a conscious, it's a subconscious reflex that amplifies the contractile signals, the action potentials, down the alpha motor neuron to the agonist, to the prime mover of that action, okay? So when rapidly stretched, these spindles initiate a monosynaptic reflex. That just means it's like a single reflex loop. And this enhances force output through increased motor unit recruitment during concentric contraction. Okay, so the eccentric stretch is what activates that myotatic reflex. And then we have also the Golgi tendon organs, another set of proprioceptors. So these are essentially not quite the opposite, but kind of the opposite of muscle spindles. They inhibit muscle activation under excessive tension. So think like, imagine if you've ever watched those videos of powerlifters like unracking massive squats and they're about to step out with them and then they suddenly collapse. That's when there's so much mechanical tension that at some point along the kinetic chain, the GTLs were just like, nope, we're out of here. There's going to be massive damage, and they just cause the muscle to relax. They inhibit the contraction. We can modulate the tolerance for high tension contractions. This is super important because think about in a plyometric contraction or a plyometric action rather, there's a lot of forces generated very rapidly. And so if the Golgi tendon organs do not have a tolerance for that, they will be triggered too early. And so if you've ever gone up for a jump or done an approach jump or maybe a broad jump or something like that, and you're running into it and you plant, but then your leg just sort of buckles and then you don't go anywhere or you trip or something like that. You didn't injure yourself, but it just doesn't you don't actually propel. It just buckles. Or potentially on a trampoline, if you remember back to last time you were on one of those as a kid, and when someone gives you a double bounce and it's a ton of rapid force up through the legs, and instead of launching you, it sort of just buckles your legs. Though that's the GTOs sensing that stretch of the muscles, that eccentric action is too much, and it's going to tear the muscle potentially. And so then it just collapses instead to save the muscle. Now, there's it's a safety feature. And so like any safety feature, it has to be tuned to keep you safe, but not to be overly cautious. And so if it's too high strung, too overly cautious, well, now we can't handle super high forces and store the energy and return it. And so that's where training comes into play. Yeah, I know, Amanda. Amanda says that's a cool insight about GTOs. It is cool. And so GTOs are involved in stretching, okay, and in regulation of kind of that slow passive tension, but also under excessive and high tension in these types of situations, they're a protective mechanism as well. Okay, so effective plyometric training will enhance muscle spindle sensitivity while mitigating GTO inhibitory response, and that facilitates greater explosive output. Okay, so when we're applying this to sport, like I've said, in rebounding sports like basketball, okay, let's say volleyball coming down for a block or from a block, rapid eccentric to concentric transitions depend heavily on the reflexes and their ability to potentiate vertical power. Okay, so let's talk about the phases. I've mentioned them already. We have the eccentric phase. During this phase, we have the preloading of the agonist muscle group. Okay, so remember, agonist is the muscle group that causes the action. So let's think of like a pogo jump, right? So the knees are unlocked, but they're mostly stiff. They're just there for a bit of shock absorption, but really the ankles.